Welcome to the Red Chair Podcast, a bite-sized podcast for associations and nonprofits covering the latest trends and issues facing association leaders. This episode discusses the application of ASAE ForesightWorks in the post-COVID world. With me is Sue Pine. Sue, can you give us a little intro about yourself?
Sure. I am a proud 40-year veteran of association management and mostly working in just 2 association management companies. I'm a longtime fan of ASAE's research and most recently over the last 10 years, the trends and foresight work.
So what is ForesightWorks and how was it intended to be used when it was first developed?
Great. The ForesightWorks product is an initiative that came out of the ASAE Research Foundation. Mm-hmm. And this was evidence-based research that was intended to help volunteer leaders and association staff be able to anticipate a really fast, evolving, changing world. We, the ASAE Research Foundation, partnered with a company called Foresight Alliance. They are professional futurists. They combine foresight, strategy, and research to help organizations kind of prepare and anticipate what's coming. The fact that it's evidence-based research was really important to the association community. Let's see. The Foresight Alliance used information that came from association professionals. They scan an organization's environment. And so when we say environment in the association community, you're talking about things like associations hold meetings, have to handle money, deal with membership. They certainly have technology, in addition to the STEEP categories: social, technology, environmental, economic, and political. The association volunteer leaders provided this information. The futurists that work for Foresight Alliance went out and scanned the environment, all the research material that's out there, came back with hundreds of trends, literally hundreds, synthesizing that down with input from the association volunteer leaders, and developing 50 drivers of change, which are clusters of trends that are going to drive change in the association community. So the material is really intended to jumpstart volunteer leaders to push their planning and thinking out further than what they were originally accustomed to doing. So most associations had a strategic plan. It would anticipate the next 1, 2, or 3 years. And with Foresight, we're saying, that's not far enough. Start thinking more like 7 to 10 years out. And that's not a natural feel for a volunteer leader or for association staff, so they grapple with it. So this is really intended to be a tool to kind of ease them into what we call the practice of foresight, integrating foresight into their routines.
So you mentioned that there's 50 topics, but there was even more before that. How was that whittled down to the top 50?
Well, again, remember in the beginning, in foresight language, they created what we call a domain map. And a domain map was every aspect that we identified of association management and put it in clusters. And that's how the trends, the hundreds of trends, were kind of fed into that and categorized according to those clusters. And then the association volunteers helped to synthesize that information and provide input on what we felt were most important or most relevant to the community.
Okay. So COVID obviously changed society and circumstances for associations and their leaders, maybe causing some of them to pause on ForesightWorks, thinking it wasn't relevant at the time, but it was relevant. It still is. In what ways is ForesightWorks relevant for association leaders still emerging from difficulties brought by COVID?
So I'll probably twist your question a little and say to you, what was the advantage of associations that already embraced foresight prior to COVID? And 2 kind of ideas that pop in my head right away. It's within the 50 drivers of change, right? there was a driver that was called virtualized meetings. And when we, pre-COVID, right, back when I'm still working in the association community, would talk about virtualized meetings with some volunteer boards, they would say like, our group would never do a virtualized meeting, or that's nice, but that's not for us. The other one was reworking career pathways, right, and aging world, right? So they didn't necessarily see or anticipate the impact of those type of drivers of change to their organizations. Organizations that were practicing foresight, which involves simply reading some of these drivers of change, understanding what the information, the data that went into these drivers, and then having discussions that really forced combinations of staff and volunteer leaders to say, so what? What could be the impact of this driver of change to our organization, the way we operate, to our members, the way their businesses operate, and what the members' needs would be, right? So there's 4 primary reasons why associations before COVID, after COVID, forever and a day, need to practice foresight. And this is really like the meat of the heart of the matter right here. One is strategic planning. Conversations that focus on a forward-thinking, longer horizon should feed into discussions that happen at strategic planning. So not just the day of the strategic plan, but conversations that happen all throughout the year, synthesizing those conversations, key observations, and feeding that to the strategic planning group makes the organization, enables the organization to make better future-focused decisions in the present. Because when you have these conversations, I said the first reason was strategic planning. The second is risk analysis. What's on the horizon changing that could impact the way you're currently operating? I like to tell people I'm old, I'm BC, before computer, right? So we saw that, I started with typewriters and adding machines. And we saw that information superhighway coming, and we never thought the volunteer board would get that, what was it, HTTP / they'll never get it. And it rocked our world, right? It changed the way we operated. So what's next that's coming down the path that could change your operations? Help you make a decision so you're not investing in technology that's soon to be outdated, right?
Yeah.
So that, the other is anticipatory learning. What does that mean? Some of these drivers of change, when you read the names of them, you think, I don't even know what they're talking about. So my favorite line is when I presented the list to a board and one of my directors raised their hand and said, blockchain. I don't even know what blockchain is. And I said, exactly. That's why we're going to talk about it. Because we don't know if blockchain will be how people will pay their dues or log their CE credit, right? So you have to at least understand the technology and then have discussions to say, what if, how could this apply to us? How could it apply to our members? These types of conversations, right? The benefits of strategic planning, risk analysis, anticipatory learning. And the fourth one is innovation and business development. Having these conversations enable you to kind of come up with ideas that you would not have surfaced before because you have new information that you're learning, right?
Yep.
So organizations that were practicing foresight probably were able to pivot sooner to virtualized meetings and telecommuting and working from home and virtual offices than organizations that weren't even aware of the technology or the process of what they could have to deal with or even budget for, right? What kind of partners will I need technology-wise if I need to convert and pivot to a virtual meeting?
It seems like associations should be a little bit more open about trying new things.
You would think. Well, I think the challenge for leaders, and I am speaking about executive committees and I'm also speaking about the staff leadership, is that there's always a hot issue to deal with, right? There's always more on your plate to deal with than time to deal with it. So asking boards to kind of make room and really weave in this practice of foresight into the way they operate doesn't come easily, right? And boards are, you can get them to think 1 to 3 years out, but asking now to push the horizon to 7 to 10 years, it doesn't come naturally, and it takes practice.
Yep. So how can leaders incorporate foresight going forward into the future when we're getting back to normal now?
Yeah, getting back to
Getting
normal.
back.
Well, let me just share with you that what we have just come through the last 14 to 15 months in foresight language is something called a wild card, right? So if boards, association leaders, were talking about some of these drivers of change, it would be a pandemic was in what they call in the cone of plausibility. It would have been a wild card. Low probability, high impact, right? The day before a wild card is not like the day after the wild card, right? So now these associations who want to better anticipate wild cards and just some of the changes that are coming down that are identified in the drivers of change action briefs, I would say keep it simple, right? Favorite line I use when I talk to organizations, associations, is start to drip foresight language into their organization and take small steps, right? So look at your existing strategic plan. Is there something on this strategic plan that sounds something like one of the 50 drivers? If so, start with that. If not, ask your president and or your chief staff executive to say, what do you think would be an easy entry point for your board, right? Something that they could identify with. Add that discussion to the board agenda early in the meeting, right? Find 20 minutes for your board to kind of get in breakout groups, have that discussion of what I mentioned to you. What's the impact potentially to our association? What's the impact to our members' organizations? And what might member needs be, right? And if they can just start every board meeting identifying one driver of change, the summary of those conversations feeding into their annual strategic plan or the update to the plan, the organization will be much richer. And it doesn't give the staff or the volunteer leaders indigestion on this concept, like make it easy for them.
Can you go into a little bit more about the updates coming in August?
Well, that's one of the fact that the ASAE Research Foundation is doing scanning and trends work is not a new phenomena. The ASAE has been doing environmental scanning for almost 30 years, since the early 1990s. However, the difference is they were doing it every 5 to 7 years. And we're saying right now the pace of change is way too fast, and we need to have continual scanning. So the ForesightWorks initiative project is very unique in that it's continuous. How can you continuously look at this? Well, we work with Foresight Alliance and our volunteer advisory board to identify new drivers of change, things that are happening now that weren't happening 3.5 years ago when we rolled this out, drivers that have evolved, that need to be updated, and then we actually retire some drivers of change or merge them into something that already exists. So let me just see real quick. Sorry. In 2020, they added 4 drivers of change, brand new drivers. Algorithms and rights, beyond recycling, China's world, and the surveillance economy. These are issues that, again, boards may think doesn't have anything to do with me. We don't do anything with China, or what's this surveillance? We're about nursing or whatever. this is where boards have to learn what this technology is about, what the subject matter is about, and then anticipate how it could impact them.
Yeah.
And now in August of 2021, this year, there are 5 new drivers coming out, and one is very related to the topic we're talking about today, and it's the post-COVID world, right? So these titles are not totally finalized because these drivers are in production now, but the post-COVID world, American stability is the second one, changing science, evolving cities, and the last one is racial reckoning. So these are things that we're seeing in the news, seeing in the world around us, and we're saying that associations need to anticipate the potential impact of these social issues to their organizations, perhaps where they hold their meetings, perhaps the type of members they're going to attract, and the type of services they could provide. So it's the freshness of the research that excites me the most. And when we talk to volunteer leaders, they also understand that, once you produce a book, it's outdated, right?
Yep.
So the continual updating and refreshing of this material is really what makes it unique and valuable to volunteer leaders.
Thank you, Sue, for coming in and talking to me. Thank you for listening to the Red Chair podcast. Head over to associationheadquarters.com so you don't miss out on any episodes. Up next, we'll be discussing the role of associations and their leaders in creating inclusive cultures.